Montreal Park is one of the best places to come and just chill in the middle of Montreal. It's huge. There's tons of trails through the trees. You can come up here and just get an overview, see the city day or night, or you can just come and find some quiet and listen to the birds. It's really lovely. Now Mount Royal and many of the other Montérégion hills have a very distinctive three-peaked ring structure. That is, the sides of the mountains are somewhat steep. At the top, there's a rim, and in the middle, there's a basin, sometimes filled with a lake, like at Mount St. Hilaire. Here in Mount Royal, it's filled with some nice park and a few cemeteries. But there are three distinct peaks. One has the big cross on top, the famous Mount Royal cross. There's another one in Outremont, which has its own beautiful hiking trails. And the third one is the Summit Peak in Westmount. Montreal lies in a long, narrow basin called the St. Lawrence Lowlands. And this is a lowland today, and that's why the river runs through it. Part of the reason why it's a lowland is because it's bounded by faults. There's a fault running along the north and west that divides it from the Grenville province, and the faults running along the southeast side divide it from the Appalachians. So the rocks in the north are older, more crystalline rocks, plutonic igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks that we'll be talking about in future weeks. The rocks to the south and east are medium grade, like green schist facies, metasedimentary rocks for the most part. We'll also be talking about those in future weeks. In the St. Lawrence lowlands, the sedimentary rocks that are here are mostly flat lying. They're very gently deformed, and that's because they're younger than a lot of the deformations affected other rocks in the region. And they're also a little bit far from the continental collisions that formed the Appalachian Mountains that occurred after these rocks were deposited. Zooming in on the Montreal area, we can see that there's a variety of rock types within the St. Lawrence lowlands. The rocks are organized in the legend with the oldest rocks to the bottom and the youngest rocks to the top, just like they would be in nature. The shades of pastel, green, yellow, purple, and blue, and the dark blue with the brick pattern, all the way up through the browns and peach colors, represent a sequence of marine sedimentary rocks, carbonates, mostly carbonates toward the bottom. And then as the rocks get younger and younger, it shifts toward siliciclastic sediments. The pattern of the rocks we can see on the map shows the older rocks down toward the south and west, and the younger rocks are up toward the north and east. That's actually reflecting the tilting of the rock strata. So that means that the rock strata are dipping a little bit toward the north and east, and that's why we see the younger rocks up that way. We can also see a lot of deformation structures on this map. The dashed lines with little arrows pointing inward and outward from them show the axes of folds that are probably related to that Appalachian orogeny. And straight, sharp lines cutting east-west across the island of Montreal show faults where the rock units have been offset laterally along those units. The other major feature we can see on this map are the Montérégion intrusions themselves. They're shown in a dark red with white cross pattern on them, and they stick out, making little circular outcrops, including our own little Mount Royal, which is actually one of the smaller ones that's situated just in downtown Montreal. We can also see on this map the rocks right around it, most local to it, are the light blue limestone unit, which is the Laval Formation limestone, and the brown unit, which is the Utica Shale. So how did all this come to be? Well, in the lower Paleozoic and the Cambrian, the old granitic rocks that at that point were already 500 million years old, at least, had faulted down, and the ocean had flowed over them and covered part of North America. The sediments were deposited in the ocean, sandstones in the Cambrian, mostly limestones and dolomites in the Ordovician and Silurian, and by the Devonian it had started to change to shales and sandstones. These built up several kilometers of sediment that now make up the St. Lawrence lowlands. Hundreds of millions of years later, in the early Cretaceous, magma erupted through the St. Lawrence lowlands. for reasons that are still a little mysterious. A significant amount of melting went on in the mantle underneath the Montreal region, and the pipes of magma came up and fed these volcanoes. Some were explosive. Some magmas crystallized underground, forming coarse plutonic rocks, and some may have formed lava flows on the paleo surface. 125 million years after the magmatism, only 20,000 years ago, huge ice sheets covered North America. They rode over Mount Royal and rode across the St. Lawrence lowlands and ground down kilometers and kilometers of sediment, exposing the interior plumbing system underneath the volcanoes, which is what we have today. It's part of the Laval Formation. It's the same type of rock underlies much of Montreal and the surrounding area. And you can see that there are layers of different colors here. The kind of massive featureless gray layers are limestone, and in between the limestone layers we see these thinner, darker layers which are have a little bit more clay in them. So this records the conditions in the ocean about 430 million years ago. At that time, the Appalachian Mountains to the south of me were starting to rise, and the climate was very warm, much more tropical than today's conditions in Montreal. So these individual layers record environmental change in the ocean. They might be seasonal, they might be the record of individual floods or storm events. And we can also see quite a bit of shelly fossil material in here that tells us who was inhabiting the Ordovician oceans. So just in front of me here I can see tiny ancient echinoderms called crinoids. They have little round fragments that make up their stem. I can see little shelly fragments that look like they might have been part of a trilobite carapace. The Redpath Museum, which is on the McGill downtown campus, has a great fossil collection and a beautiful diorama that reconstructs the Ordovician Sea from fossils found in the Laval Formation and elsewhere. Most of these animals are extinct, but it puts them in life position and shows how they might have interacted with one another 460 million years ago. Along with the rest of the St. Lawrence lowlands Paleozoic strata, the Laval Formation was the host rock or country rock for the intrusions of the Montéregion's magmas at about 125 million years ago. This formed the gabbros, the plutonic mafic rocks that are the core of Mount Royal today. And through interaction with heat and perhaps fluids brought up by the magmas, there was alteration of the surrounding limestones and shales to make skarns and hornfells, two contact metamorphic rocks, which you can see on Mount Royal. So what exactly happens to a rock when it's baked by contact metamorphism? Well, the little tiny crystals that make up that rock, some of those minerals start to fuse with the minerals around them. So it cements it together much harder, and it also usually interlinks silica bonds from one mineral grain to another. And this hornfels is very hard and silicified. And it's so much so that instead of its usual flat, plainy rock cleavage that the original shale had, it actually has conchoidal fracture like glass or like quartz. Conchoidal fracture is when you get circular ribs on a fracture emanating from a point, very much like glass in the car windshield. I'm overlooking Beaver Lake, and I've come across a cluster of boulders that were clearly placed here with a backhoe for decorative purposes in the park. But these boulders are locally derived, or at least they're from the formations of this area, maybe not from Mount Royal itself. And they have a great example of an intrusive relationship. There's a dike of magma. I'm gonna guess that it solidified underground, but not very far underground, because it's very fine-grained. So fine-grained that I'm gonna call it basalt, even though it's an intrusive rock. Now, one of the reasons why extrusive rocks usually are fine-grained is because they cool so fast when they come out of the surface of the earth. They're not insulated anymore. And this dike is so narrow that it would have actually cooled very fast. There's not a huge amount of thermal mass that would have made the temperature stay high for long enough to grow big crystals. This dike has a really beautiful altered margin along the edges where the limestone has been bleached white, and the rock takes on a little bit of a different grain to it, a different fabric. And that's where that little bit of heat that came from this basaltic intrusion cooked up the limestone and started to turn it into a little bit of a scarn. How can you tell when a limestone has started to be altered to become a scarn? Well, one of the first signs of hydrothermal or temperature-related alteration is that those little tiny calcite crystals, which are so small you can't even see them in the normal gray limestone, grow bigger and bigger and start to look like little interlocking angular crystals. See that it's got a grainy texture. There's individual faceted grains here, and if I look with my hand lens, I can see that each one is like a little transparent gray blade with striations on its surfaces, a proper calcite crystal. I wouldn't be able to see that if this rock hadn't been coarsened, hadn't grown to bigger crystals on account of the thermal effects of the intrusions nearby. These streaks, which are not carbonate, they're actually something else. They're more silica rich. I think that those are the shaly, the clastic sedimentary interbeds that are inherited from the original limestone. But they've become way more crystalline, they're much harder, and they've taken on a kind of a yellowy green color, which means new minerals are growing inside. That's also triggered by the heat and maybe some of the very hot water that came out of the intrusion while it was crystallizing. This beautiful layer, which used to be a flat, originally planar and horizontal shale layer, is now all crumpled up, and that crumpling indicates that the rock has actually lost volume. It's gotten shorter in this direction, and the calcite gives up easily. It can dissolve and flow away in the hot waters, and that's where the volume loss happened. But this silica, it doesn't give up and flow away as easily, so it gets crumpled and shortened and makes those little squinchy folds that you can see there. Because this dike is so small and the amount of heat that came from it is really small too, there wasn't long enough and there wasn't enough chemical interaction in order to really develop a scarn here. But on the scale of Mount Royal and around the big gabbroic intrusions that make the core of this mountain, there was a lot more heat and a lot more chemical interaction over a longer period of time. That's why very interesting minerals are found in these scarns. In fact, around the Monte regions, Mount St. Hilaire in particular, there are a number of minerals that are found in the scarns because of the interaction between these two rock types with heat, with fluid, that don't exist anywhere else in the world or were first discovered here and have only been discovered at a few other places. Okay, just behind me is an outcrop of the core rock that makes up Mount Royal and all the Monte regions. This hard plutonic igneous rock is the reason why the Monte regions are here as little mountains standing all alone on today's landscape. Nobody knows exactly why, but the mantle underneath North America in this region produced some melts about 125 million years ago, and where they worked their way up near the surface, they formed conduits that fed some volcanoes. And the core conduit here that fed the Mount Royal volcano, which was 2 kilometers above where I'm sitting, is left today in terms of the magma that solidified underground in the conduit, and that is this gabbro right here. Now, gabbro is a mafic rock, and that means it's rich in iron and magnesium, up to maybe 15% or even higher, and it's relatively low in silica, and that usually means it's less than half silica. Rocks are really made of silica, so half being 50% silica is a relatively low silica rock, and that's what this gabbro is. So in the areas where this particular melt had erupted to the surface, which would have been the real volcano of Mount Royal 2 kilometers above me, there would have been basalt. It would have turned into basalt when it solidified at the surface, because that is the extrusive or volcanic equivalent of this intrusive rock, which is gabbro. Gabbro is made up of 2 main groups of minerals. One of them is a feldspar, usually a calcium-rich feldspar called plagioclase, and the other one will be an iron and magnesium-rich silicate mineral, usually a pyroxene. And here in this gabbro, we also have some amphiboles because this gabbro is a little bit unusual and has some extra potassium compared to a typical gabbro. There are some really interesting features on this outcrop. One of my favorites here is this network of kind of dirty off-white looking veins that are cutting through and dividing angular blocks of black pyroxene rich rock. So this is a breccia. A breccia is a bunch of angular fragments of rock that are stuck together by something else that's gluing them together. And in this case, we have a very pyroxene-rich type of gabbro that was broken up after it crystallized. It broke, and other magmas that are more rich in plagioclase snuck in and cemented the pieces together again and made this beautiful rock. This detailed geologic map by Pierre Bedard shows the distribution of all these different rock types that we've just seen on Mount Royal. The pink in the center of the mountain is the gabbro, and like I just showed you, there's a lot of variation even within a single outcrop, so it's worth exploring and seeing a number of different places. Around the edges, we see some gabbro-related rocks that have even a little more unusual chemistry in the green and yellow colors. The beigeish color is hornfells. That's showing areas where the country rock is still present and has been altered next to the intrusion. And the little red patches to the northwest of the mountain are volcanic breccias that came up off these conduits off to the side of the main gabbroic plug. And the area where you just see the city with no color at all, that's all underlain by limestone and shale and unmetamorphosed rock.
These rocks are called beds because they're very firm and still. So that's what we do when we throw rocks, and we get the rocks from here and we throw them down on the